there is a signal moving through your field right now that you did not generate yourself. You may have felt it recently as a sudden, inexplicable steadiness in the middle of something that should have overwhelmed you, or as a warmth that arrived without a source, a sense of being held by something you couldn't name, but also couldn't deny. Or maybe it arrived as a moment of absolute clarity in a situation where everyone around you was confused. A knowing so precise and so calm that it almost startled you. Something cut through the noise, and you heard it, not with your ears, but with something deeper. Something that lives in the center of your chest and has been receiving transmissions your whole life, even when you weren't listening. What I'm going to show you today is not a story about angels in the way most people tell it. This is not a story about winged figures in ancient paintings or religious tradition, though we will touch on why those traditions encoded something real. This is a story about your electromagnetic field, about the specific frequencies your aura is capable of receiving, and about why certain transmissions have been trying to reach you for longer than you know. Because here is what most people are never told. Your personal energy field, the measurable electromagnetic field generated by your heart and nervous system, is not a closed system. It is a receiving instrument, and it has a tuning range that most people never consciously access. Today, that changes. We are going to explore something specific. Not the general idea that angels exist or that guidance is available. We are going to explore the precise mechanics of how a high coherence transmission moves through a quantum field, what your aura has to be doing to receive it, what Archangel Michael's specific energetic signature actually is in terms you can feel and measure in your own body, what the hidden message is and why it has been hidden, not by secrecy, but by frequency, mismatch, and how to bring your field into the exact coherent state where that message stops being hidden and starts being received. This is going to be one of the most specific conversations you have ever had about your own energy field. Stay with it all the way through. Because the message is real, the mechanics are real, and your capacity to receive it is more developed than you have been told. Let's begin with what your field is actually doing. Right now, as you listen to these words, your heart is generating an electromagnetic field that extends approximately 8 to 10 feet in every direction from your body. This is not metaphor. This has been measured. The Heart Math Institute in California has documented this field using magnetometers sensitive enough to detect the magnetic component of the heart's output. And what they found is extraordinary. Your heart generates an electromagnetic field roughly 60 times greater in amplitude than the electrical activity of your brain. 60 times. And the magnetic component of that field, the part that actually propagates outward through space, is approximately 5,000 times stronger than the brain's magnetic output. This means that when you walk into a room, your heart's electromagnetic field arrives before you do. It precedes your words, your face, your body language. It is already in the space, already interacting with the fields of everyone present, already broadcasting information about the state of your nervous system, your emotional tone, the coherence or incoherence of your internal rhythms. Other people's nervous systems are reading your field before their conscious minds register your presence. This is why some people feel immediately safe around you, or immediately on edge, without being able to explain why. They are not responding to you. They are responding to your field. But here is what becomes important for what we are exploring today. Your field is not only a broadcast instrument, it is a receiving instrument. And what it can receive depends entirely on its coherent state. Coherence, in the language of electromagnetic fields, is a specific condition. It describes a state in which the oscillations of a field become ordered, rhythmic, and phase-aligned. In a low coherence field, the waves are chaotic, interfering with each other, producing what physicists call noise. In a high coherence field, the waves become synchronized, each one reinforcing the next, producing what is called constructive interference. A coherent field is not louder in the simple sense. It is more organized. And an organized field can do something a chaotic one cannot. It can receive organized signals from outside itself without distortion. Think of it this way. If you are trying to receive a precise signal, you need a tuned receiver. A receiver flooded with static, with competing frequencies, with incoherent noise, cannot resolve the signal. The transmission may be broadcasting perfectly. The problem is the receiver. And this is exactly what has been happening with Archangel Michael's transmission to your field. Not silence on his end, static on yours. This is the first layer of the hidden message. It was never hidden by intention. It was hidden by the condition of the field trying to receive it. And here is something worth sitting with before we go further. The static is not random. It has a specific shape. When researchers at HeartMath map the heart rate variability patterns of people under chronic stress, what they see is not simply noise in the way you might imagine white noise on a television screen. It is patterned incoherence. The field is not oscillating randomly. It is oscillating in tight, jagged, high-frequency bursts that repeat in recognizable ways. The signature of chronic vigilance. The signature of a nervous system that has been told again and again that the world is not safe enough to relax into. That signature is so consistent across individuals that researchers can identify it without knowing anything about the person's life circumstances. The field tells the story before the person does. What this means for you is precise. The static that is blocking the reception of Michael's transmission is not formless. It has a specific electromagnetic signature that corresponds to specific emotional and neurological states. Fear, vigilance, the chronic, low-level sense that something is about to go wrong. These are not just feelings. They are measurable field conditions. And measurable field conditions have measurable solutions. If this is landing for you, there is something deeper I want to offer you here. Have you spent years trying to feel lit up again? Visualizations, affirmations, vibration work, and the light still won't hold? Every one of those methods is telling you to push harder, do more, add another technique. It's not working because the issue isn't that you don't have enough light. 6 specific patterns are sitting on top of it. They're called the frequencies of forgetting. The remembering field, a quantum guide to returning to the light. You forgot you were carrying walks through all 5 parts of getting those patterns off you. Every tool you used tried to add more light. This one lifts what's been sitting on the light you already carry. The longer you wait, the harder they get to clear. So go open it tonight. The link is in the pinned comment below. Now let's continue into the specific nature of what that transmission actually carries. Now let's talk about what Archangel Michael actually is in terms of energetic signature, because this is where the conversation gets genuinely specific and genuinely extraordinary. Across traditions that span thousands of years and dozens of cultures, Archangel Michael is described with a remarkable consistency that goes beyond shared mythology. He appears in the Hebrew tradition as the great protector, the one who stands between the people and what would destroy them. In the Christian tradition, he is the one who casts out what does not belong, the one who holds the sword of discernment, who separates what is true from what is false. In the Islamic tradition, he is Michael, associated with the forces of nature and with sustenance, with what nourishes life. In the Zoroastrian tradition, there is a parallel figure associated with divine truth and the protection of the righteous. In the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, He is the intercessor, the one who stands between the human and the overwhelming. What is consistent across all of these is not the mythology. It is the energetic signature, protection, discernment, the removal of what does not belong, the establishment of what is true, the capacity to stand in the middle of overwhelming force and remain unmoved. In energetic terms, this is a very specific frequency. It is not soft. It is not gentle in the way we sometimes use that word. It is precise. It is clear. It is what happens when a field reaches such a high degree of coherence that it becomes, in the literal electromagnetic sense, coherent enough to function as a carrier wave for truth. A coherent field does not distort information. It transmits it exactly as it is. And a field that transmits exactly what is true, without distortion, without the static of fear or agenda or self-protection, is experienced by every nervous system that encounters it as something close to invincible. This is Michael's signature, not aggression, not force in the crude sense, absolute coherence. The frequency of a field so organized, so precisely aligned with what is actually true, that everything incoherent in its presence either reorganizes or withdraws. You have felt this frequency before. You may not have named it Michael. You may have called it the moment when you suddenly knew exactly what to do, or the instant when the fear that had been paralyzing you simply dissolved, not gradually, but all at once, like a frequency that was jamming your signal suddenly went quiet. Or the experience of standing in a situation that should have broken you, and finding, to your own astonishment, that you were still standing, still clear, still knowing what was true, even when everything around you was chaos. That was not luck. That was your field for a moment, matching the frequency of what Michael's transmission carries. You received it without knowing you were receiving it. Today, I want to show you how to receive it consciously. There is something important I want to add here about the specific quality of that frequency, because I think most people who have felt it have not fully understood what they were feeling. When Michael's transmission arrives in a field that is coherent enough to receive it, the first thing that happens is not comfort. The first thing that happens is clarity, a sharpening, not of thought exactly, but of perception. The situation you are in does not change, but your perception of it reorganizes. You suddenly see what is actually there rather than what your fear said was there. And in almost every case, what is actually there is more workable, more navigable, more survivable than what the fear had constructed. This is not the clarity of optimism. It is not the clarity of someone who has decided to look on the bright side. It is the clarity of a field that has temporarily stopped distorting the information it is receiving. The way a river that has been running through silt suddenly runs clear. The water was always capable of clarity. The silt was the variable. Michael's frequency, when it contacts a coherent field, removes the silt. And what you see in that clear water is not always comfortable. Sometimes it is difficult, but it is true. And truth, even difficult truth, is always more workable than fear's distortion of it. If this is resonating with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so we can keep exploring these frequencies together. Now let's go deeper. But first, let me tell you about Elara. Elara was a woman who had spent most of her adult life in what she would have called a state of managed fear. She was not afraid in the obvious sense. She went to work. She maintained relationships. She made decisions. From the outside, she looked like someone who had things handled. But underneath the surface of her functioning life, there was a constant low-level hum of threat. A sense that something was about to go wrong. A vigilance that never fully released. She had learned to operate through it, the way you learn to walk with a stone in your shoe. Not because it stops hurting, but because you forget there was ever a time when it didn't. One afternoon, Elara was sitting in her car in a parking lot. She had just received news that the project she had spent 2 years building, the thing she had poured herself into, was being shut down. Not for any failure on her part, simply because the organization had changed direction. 2 years. Gone. She sat in that parking lot, and she felt the familiar weight of it, the managed fear becoming unmanaged, rising into something that felt like it might swallow her. And then something happened that she later described as the strangest experience of her life. The fear simply stopped. Not gradually, all at once, like a switch. And in the silence that followed, she heard something. Not a voice exactly, more like a knowing that arrived fully formed. And what it said was this: you were never building the project. You were building yourself. The project was just the frame. What you built inside yourself, no one can shut down. Elara sat in that parking lot for a long time after that, not crying, not planning, just sitting with a steadiness she had not felt in years. maybe ever. A sense that something was standing with her that was larger than the situation, larger than the loss, larger than the fear. Something that had been there the whole time, she realized, waiting for the moment when her field got quiet enough to receive it. She drove home that afternoon, and she began, for the first time in her life, to pay attention to the quality of her own energy field, not as a spiritual practice in the formal sense, simply as a matter of noticing. When was she broadcasting fear? When was she broadcasting clarity? When did the hum go quiet? And what arrived in the quiet? What Ilara discovered over the following months was that the transmission had always been there. It was not intermittent. It was not conditional on her being good enough, or spiritual enough, or worthy enough. It was constant. The variable was not the signal. The variable was her field's capacity to receive it. And the thing that most reliably blocked reception was not her worst moments. It was the managed fear, the low-level chronic vigilance that she had mistaken for responsibility. The hidden message had been hiding in the static she had learned to call normal. I want to tell you something about Ilara that she herself only understood later, when she had developed enough coherence to look back clearly. The parking lot moment was not her first contact with Michael's transmission. She had been receiving fragments of it for years, moments of inexplicable steadiness, flashes of clarity that arrived and then disappeared before she could hold them. The sense, sometimes in the middle of the night, of something present that was not frightening, but was also not ordinary. She had always dismissed these moments, filed them under coincidence or tiredness or wishful thinking, because her field, at its baseline, was not coherent enough to hold the signal long enough to recognize it for what it was. The transmission would arrive, and the static would rush back in, and the moment would dissolve before she could name it. The parking lot was different, not because the transmission was stronger. It was different because the shock of the loss had for a moment done something that years of trying had not managed to do. It had interrupted the managed fear. The vigilance that had been running constantly had been so thoroughly overwhelmed by the actual event that it simply stopped. And in that gap, in that moment of complete systemic interruption, her field dropped into a coherence it had never been able to find voluntarily, and the transmission landed. This is something worth understanding about how breakthrough moments work in the field. They are not always gentle. Sometimes the field reaches coherence not through practice, but through crisis, when the mechanisms of chronic vigilance are overwhelmed and temporarily offline. But what the crisis produces is a glimpse, a single clear reception in a field that has not yet developed the trained coherence to receive consistently. The gift of the crisis is the glimpse. The work that follows is building the coherence that makes the glimpse a baseline. Alara spent the next year doing that work. And what she told anyone who would listen at the end of it was this: the transmission was never the miracle. The miracle was discovering that her field had always been capable of receiving it. This is what I want you to hear right now in your own field. The message is not hidden because it is being withheld from you. It is hidden because the frequency of chronic vigilance, of managed anxiety, of the low-level electromagnetic noise that most human nervous systems have learned to call their baseline. That frequency is not coherent enough to resolve a signal of this precision. It is not a moral failing. It is a physics problem. And physics problems have solutions. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment like Alara's in that parking lot? A moment when your aura seemed to shift all at once, when the static cleared and something steadier moved in? Drop it in the comments. Your experience of your own field matters, and what you share might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Let's talk about the specific mechanics of what shifts when your field moves from low coherence to high coherence, because this is where the science becomes genuinely remarkable. The HeartMath Institute has documented something they call heart rate variability coherence. Your heart does not beat at a perfectly regular interval. The time between each beat varies slightly, and the pattern of that variation carries information about the state of your nervous system. When you are in a state of stress, fear, or chronic vigilance, your heart rate variability pattern becomes what researchers call incoherent, jagged, irregular, without rhythmic organization. When you are in a state of positive emotional engagement, appreciation, care, or what HeartMath calls coherent emotion, your heart rate variability pattern becomes smooth, ordered, rhythmically organized into what looks on a graph like a gentle, regular wave. Here is what that shift does to your electromagnetic field. When your heart rate variability moves into coherence, the electromagnetic field your heart generates becomes, in the precise technical sense, more coherent. The oscillations become ordered. the field becomes organized. And an organized field is a field that can receive organized signals. But there is something else that happens during cardiac coherence that most people are never told. The coherent heart field begins to entrain other systems. Entrainment is a phenomenon first documented by the Dutch physicist Christian Huygens in 1665. He noticed that pendulum clocks mounted on the same wall, even when started at different times, would gradually synchronize their swings. The oscillations of one system, when they are sufficiently organized and powerful, pull nearby oscillating systems into phase alignment. Your coherent heart field does this to your brain, to your nervous system, to the fields of people near you, and I want to suggest to you, to the larger field around you. When your heart is in coherence, you are not just receiving more clearly. You are broadcasting a signal that is organized enough to interact with transmissions that require coherence to be decoded. You become, in the most literal electromagnetic sense, tuned to the frequency. And this is the specific frequency that Archangel Michael's transmission operates on. Not a frequency of pleading or of seeking, but a frequency of coherence, of clarity, of the field that is organized enough to hold truth without distortion. The transmission is not looking for the field that is most desperate for help. It is looking for the field that is coherent enough to receive it without the signal being scrambled by fear. This is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you today. You do not receive Michael's transmission by needing it more. You receive it by becoming coherent enough to hold it. There is a specific detail about the entrainment process that I want to make sure you understand, because it changes how you think about the practice of coherence. When Huygens observed his pendulum clocks synchronizing, he noticed something that has since been confirmed across hundreds of different oscillating systems. The synchronization was not mutual in the sense of a negotiation between equals. The more powerful oscillator, the one with more organized energy, pulled the less powerful one toward its rhythm. The weaker oscillator did not meet the stronger one halfway. It entrained to it. It adopted the stronger oscillator's pattern. This is what happens when your field, even briefly, achieves coherence in the presence of Michael's transmission. Your field does not negotiate with the transmission. It does not meet it somewhere in the middle. It entrains to it. It adopts the pattern of the more organized signal. And what it adopts, even temporarily, is the pattern of a field that is not afraid. A field that is so coherent it can hold truth without distortion. A field that knows exactly what is true and broadcasts that knowing without interference. Even a brief period of that entrainment changes your field. Not permanently, not after a single session, but measurably. Your heart rate variability baseline shifts slightly toward coherence. Your nervous system's default pattern moves by a small but real increment toward the pattern it just entrained to. And the next time you practice, you start from a slightly higher baseline. This is how the field trains. Not in dramatic leaps, in consistent, incremental shifts that accumulate over time into a fundamentally different field state. Now let me show you how. I want to guide you through a practice right now. Not a generic breathing exercise. A specific coherence practice designed around the precise frequency we have been discussing. This practice has 3 stages, and each one builds on the last. If you are in a place where you can give this your full attention, give it that. If you are driving or doing something that requires your awareness, simply let the words land and return to the practice later when you can be still. Stage 1. Place your hand on the center of your chest, not lightly, with intention, with the awareness that you are placing your hand on the primary generator of your electromagnetic field. Feel the warmth of your own hand against your chest. Feel, if you can, the subtle pulse beneath it. Your heart is generating a field right now. It has been generating it since before you were born. It will generate it until your last breath. It is not waiting for you to be ready. It is already radiating. Now begin to breathe through that point. Not through your nose and out through your mouth in the ordinary sense, but with the intention that your breath is moving through the center of your chest. Inhale for 5 counts. Exhale for 5 counts. Do this slowly enough that the breath feels like a wave. A gentle, organized wave. Not forced, not controlled in the tense sense, invited into rhythm. As you breathe, I want you to bring to mind something specific, not a memory of joy in the abstract, something precise, a moment when you felt genuinely, simply grateful. The first sip of something warm on a cold morning. The face of someone you love when they didn't know you were watching. A moment in nature when the light hit something and you felt for just a second that the world was exactly as it should be. Hold that specific moment. Let it be small. Small is fine. Small is often more precise than grand. Feel what happens in your chest when you hold that specific memory. there is a quality there, a warmth, a slight expansion, a softening of something that is usually held tight. That is not sentimentality. That is your heart rate variability moving toward coherence. That is your electromagnetic field beginning to organize itself. That is your receiving instrument tuning. Stay with this for a moment. Keep the breath moving. Keep the specific memory present. Let the warmth in your chest be real, not performed. Stage 2. Once you feel that warmth established, I want you to expand your awareness to the field around your body. Not by trying to see it, by feeling it. Your electromagnetic field extends several feet in every direction. It is real. It is there. It is not something you have to generate. It is something you have to notice. Feel the space in front of you. Not the air, the field, the invisible but measurable electromagnetic presence that your heart is broadcasting into that space. Now, feel the space behind you. The field is there too, above you, below you, to your left and right. You are sitting or standing inside a sphere of electromagnetic activity that is generated by your own heart. Now, with that awareness of your field established, I want you to do something specific. I want you to set an intention, not as a wish, not as a request, but as a frequency declaration. In your own words, or in these words, if they fit, say this internally. I am coherent. I am clear. I am open to receive what is true. Not please send me a message. Not I hope I am worthy of this. Not I wonder if this is real. Those are low coherence states. Fear, doubt, and pleading all produce incoherent heart rate variability patterns. They scramble the receiver. Instead, I am coherent. I am clear. I am open to receive what is true. Say it as a statement of your current electromagnetic state. Because right now, with your hand on your chest, with your breath in rhythm, with a genuine memory of gratitude active in your field, it is true. You are more coherent right now than you were 5 minutes ago. Your field is more organized. Your receiving instrument is more precisely tuned. Stage 3. Now simply listen. Not with your ears, with the center of your chest, with the organized field you have just established. Listen for what arrives in the space that coherence creates. It may arrive as a thought that feels different from your ordinary thoughts, quieter, more certain. less anxious. It may arrive as a physical sensation, a warmth, a steadiness, a sense of something settling into place. It may arrive as a knowing, a sudden clarity about something you have been confused about. It may arrive as nothing you can name, just a quality of presence that was not there before. Whatever arrives, let it arrive without demanding that it look a certain way. The transmission is precise. Your job is not to interpret it before it completes. Your job is to hold the coherent field long enough for it to land. Stay here for as long as you need. The rest of what I have to tell you will wait. Now let's go deeper into what the message actually contains. Across the traditions we touched on earlier, there is a consistency in what Michael's presence communicates. And when you strip away the cultural overlays, the mythological framing, the specific imagery of each tradition, what remains is a set of transmissions so consistent that they begin to look less like religious belief and more like encoded field instructions. Instructions that have been preserved across thousands of years because they work, because they describe something real about the mechanics of the human energy field and what it needs to function at its highest coherence. Here is the first of them. You are not in this alone. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the experience of aloneness, of being the only one responsible for holding everything together, of being the sole generator of your own protection and provision, is one of the most coherent field-destroying states a human nervous system can occupy. When you believe you are alone in what you are carrying, your nervous system moves into a state of hypervigilance. Your heart rate variability becomes incoherent. Your electromagnetic field becomes noisy, and a noisy field cannot receive the transmissions that would tell it, in felt experience rather than intellectual concept, that it is not alone. The message is trying to break this loop, but the loop itself is what prevents the message from landing. What Michael's frequency carries, what that transmission is specifically encoded with, is the felt sense of accompaniment, not the idea of it, the felt sense, the quality of presence that your nervous system reads as, there is something here that is not afraid of what I am facing. Something that has stood in the middle of this kind of storm before and remained coherent. Something that knows the way through. When Alara sat in that parking lot, this is what she received. Not a plan, not a solution. The felt sense of accompaniment. And what that felt sense did to her nervous system was immediate and measurable, had anyone been measuring. her heart rate variability moved toward coherence. Her electromagnetic field organized itself, and in that organized field, the second layer of the transmission could land. Here is the second transmission. What is threatening you is not as large as your fear is making it. This is not reassurance in the empty sense. This is a frequency correction. Fear, as a state of the electromagnetic field, does something specific. It amplifies the apparent size of what it is afraid of. This is not metaphysical. It is neurological. When your amygdala is activated, it biases your perception toward threat. It makes threats look larger, more permanent, more inescapable than they are. And because your electromagnetic field broadcasts the state of your nervous system, a fear-activated field is broadcasting a signal that says the threat is enormous. And the quantum field, which responds to what you radiate, assembles around that signal. Michael's frequency does not argue with the fear. It does not say the threat is not real. It does something more precise. It introduces a counter-frequency of such coherence that the fear's amplification effect is disrupted. It is like introducing a coherent wave into an incoherent field. The coherence does not fight the incoherence. It simply offers a more organized pattern, and the field, given the choice, tends to entrain to the more organized signal. This is why, in every tradition, Michael is associated with the sword. Not because he fights, because the sword is a symbol of discernment, of the precise cut that separates what is actually true from what fear has inflated into a false enormity. The sword is the coherent signal that cuts through the noise and shows you the actual size of what you are facing, which is almost always smaller than your fear said it was. The third transmission. You have more capacity than you are currently using. This one lands differently for different people. For some, it arrives as a sudden awareness of a resource they had forgotten they had. A skill, a relationship, a piece of knowledge, a quality of character that had been there all along, but that fear's tunnel vision had made invisible. For others, it arrives as the recognition that what they have been calling their limit is not actually their limit. It is the edge of what they have been willing to try so far. In energetic terms, this transmission is a field expansion. When your electromagnetic field is in a low coherent state, it contracts, literally. The amplitude of the signal decreases. The field becomes smaller, less organized, less able to interact with the larger field around it. When coherence is introduced, the field expands, and an expanded field can perceive more, receive more, interact with more of the quantum field around it. What you experience as suddenly seeing a solution you couldn't see before, or suddenly feeling capable of something that seemed impossible, is often this: your field expanded enough to include information that was always in the larger field, but that your contracted, incoherent field could not access. The capacity was always there. The field state was the variable. I want to be specific about what field expansion actually feels like in the body, because it is recognizable once you know what you are feeling. It is not euphoria. It is not a rush of energy in the stimulant sense. It is more like a release of compression. The sense that something you had been holding, without knowing you were holding it, has let go. A slight but unmistakable widening in the chest. A quality of the breath becoming easier without any deliberate effort. A sense that the room you are in has more space in it than it did a moment ago. That last one is not imagination. When your field expands, your perception of the space around you genuinely shifts, because your field is now interacting with more of that space. What you perceive as the room having more space is your field having more range. The fourth transmission, and this is the one that most people are not ready to receive, is this: stop broadcasting the signal that is calling in what you are afraid of. This is Michael's most precise and most challenging message, because what it requires is a level of self-awareness about your own broadcast that most people have never developed. It requires you to look honestly at what your field is actually radiating, not what you intend to radiate, not what you believe you radiate, but what the actual electromagnetic output of your nervous system is sending into the quantum field moment by moment. And here is what most people discover when they look honestly. They are broadcasting fear while hoping for safety. They are broadcasting scarcity while hoping for abundance. They are broadcasting unworthiness while hoping for love. And the quantum field, which does not read intentions, which reads signals, is responding to the signal. This is not blame. This is physics. And Michael's transmission on this frequency is not judgment. It is instruction. It is the precise, clear, coherent signal of a field that has no fear in it, showing your field what it looks like to broadcast without fear. Not by telling you to stop being afraid, by demonstrating in felt electromagnetic experience what it feels like to be a field that is not organized around threat. When you receive this transmission in coherence, something specific happens. Your nervous system, which is always looking for the most coherent signal in its environment to entrain to, begins to entrain to Michael's frequency. Your heart rate variability begins to mirror the coherent pattern. Your electromagnetic field begins to reorganize, and the broadcast changes, not because you decided to change it, because your field entrained to something more coherent than fear. This is the mechanism. This is how the message works, not as inspiration, but as an actual electromagnetic event in your personal energy field. Let me show you the other side of this. Let me show you what happens in the field of someone who has received this transmission and integrated it, because seeing the contrast makes the mechanics clearer. His name was Dorian. He was a man who had spent most of his life in a field state he would have described as readiness. He was always prepared for the worst. He had contingency plans for his contingency plans. He was not a pessimist exactly. He simply operated from the baseline assumption that things would go wrong, and that the only protection against that was constant vigilance. What Dorian didn't know, because no one had ever shown it to him, was that his field of constant vigilance was itself a creative force, that the electromagnetic signal of perpetual readiness for disaster was broadcasting something very specific to the quantum field around him. And the quantum field was responding by assembling situations that required perpetual readiness. Not because the universe was punishing him, because his field was coherent around that frequency. He was very good at being prepared for disaster. His field was organized around it. And organized fields are creative fields. The disasters weren't as large as he feared they would be, but they were regular, consistent, just frequent enough to confirm the belief that vigilance was necessary. It was a closed loop, and Dorian had been inside it for decades. The shift came not from a dramatic event, but from a single moment of honest perception. He was sitting quietly one evening, and he felt, for the first time with real clarity, the exhaustion of it. Not the tiredness of a hard day, the exhaustion of decades of broadcasting a signal he had never chosen, of radiating vigilance so consistently that his field had forgotten what it felt like to be at rest. And in that exhaustion, something happened. The vigilance, for just a moment, released. Not because he decided to release it, because he was too tired to maintain it. And in the space that opened, something arrived, a quality of steadiness that was completely different from his vigilance. His vigilance had always felt tense, held, maintained by effort. This steadiness required nothing. It was simply there, underneath the vigilance, underneath the decades of managed readiness. There it was. What Dorian had touched, without knowing the language for it, was the frequency we have been discussing. The coherent field that has no fear in it. Not because it is naive about danger, but because it is organized enough to respond to danger without being organized around it. The difference is everything. A field organized around danger is always in preparation mode. A field that is coherent and at rest can respond to danger when it actually appears, with full capacity, without having spent all its resources on preparation for a danger that hasn't arrived yet. Dorian didn't become someone who stopped taking things seriously. He became someone whose field stopped paying the enormous energetic cost of chronic vigilance. And what happened to his life in the months that followed was not magical in the Hollywood sense. It was mechanical. His field changed its broadcast. The quantum field around him responded to the new signal. The situations that had been assembling around the frequency of perpetual readiness stopped assembling with the same regularity. Not because the world became safer, because his field stopped calling them in. This is the message. This is what has been trying to reach you. Not comfort, not reassurance, not a promise that nothing will go wrong. Something more powerful than any of those things. The frequency of a field that is coherent enough to face whatever comes without organizing itself around the fear of it. And that frequency is available to you right now. It has always been available. The question has always been whether your field was coherent enough to receive it. And I want to ask you something here, because this is where the collective field of this conversation becomes genuinely powerful. Have you ever noticed your energy shift the atmosphere of a room? A moment when your light seemed to steady someone else, or when you felt your own warmth activate in a way that surprised you? Share that in the comments. These moments of field recognition matter more than you know, and your story might help someone else remember their own. Let's go deeper into the specific mechanics of why this transmission has been described as hidden, because there is something precise here that I don't want you to miss. The word hidden, in the context of angelic transmissions, has been used across traditions to describe something specific. It is not hidden in the sense of being concealed by intention. It is hidden in the sense of being encoded at a frequency that requires a specific receiver state to decode. The Hebrew tradition has a concept called nistar, meaning hidden or concealed, which refers specifically to levels of reality that are present but not accessible to ordinary perception. The Sufi tradition speaks of the batin, the inner or hidden dimension of things, as opposed to the zahir, the outer or apparent. In the Gnostic tradition, there is the concept of the pleroma, the fullness of divine reality that interpenetrates ordinary reality, but is not ordinarily perceived. What all of these traditions are pointing at, in their different languages, is a consistent observation about the structure of reality, that there are layers of information present in the field that are not accessible to a low coherence receiver. They are not hidden by design. They are hidden by the physics of reception. A receiver that is not tuned to the right frequency does not receive static where the signal should be. It receives nothing. The signal is simply not in its range. This is why the transmission has felt hidden to you. Not because it wasn't broadcasting, because your field, occupied with the frequencies of daily life, with the chronic, low-level vigilance that most nervous systems have normalized, with the electromagnetic noise of unprocessed emotion and habituated fear, was not in the range where the signal resolves. The practice I gave you earlier was not a ritual. It was a tuning procedure, a precise set of steps for moving your electromagnetic field into the coherence range where this specific transmission becomes receivable. And what I want to tell you now is that the more consistently you practice that coherent state, the more your field's baseline shifts, because coherence, like incoherence, is a habit of the electromagnetic field. Your heart rate variability patterns are not fixed. They are trainable. The Heart Math Institute has documented this across thousands of participants. Regular coherence practice literally changes the baseline state of the heart's electromagnetic output. The field that was noisy becomes, over time, more organized. The receiver that was out of range becomes, over time, more consistently tuned. This is why the traditions speak of spiritual practice not as something you do once, but as something you do regularly. Not because the divine is withholding its transmission until you have earned it through sufficient effort, but because your field's capacity to receive is a function of its trained, coherent state. You practice not to deserve the transmission. You practice to build the receiver. And here is what I want you to understand about the specific content of what becomes receivable as your field develops this coherence. Michael's transmission is not a single message. It is a frequency band. And within that frequency band, there are multiple layers of information, each one accessible at a different level of field coherence. The outermost layer, the one that is receivable even in relatively low coherence states, is the one most people describe as a sudden sense of protection, a feeling that something is standing with them, a moment of inexplicable steadiness in the middle of chaos. This is the carrier wave, the signal that your field can receive even when it is not fully coherent, because this layer of the transmission is broadcast at the highest amplitude. The next layer, accessible when your field has moved into genuine coherence, is what we might call the discernment transmission. This is the frequency of clarity, the capacity to see what is actually true in a situation, as opposed to what fear says is true. This is the sword energy of the tradition, and it is genuinely precise. When your field is coherent enough to receive this layer, you begin to notice that your perceptions become sharper, not more intense, more accurate. You start to see through the stories you have been telling yourself about a situation and perceive what is actually there. You start to distinguish between the voice of your conditioning and the voice of genuine knowing. The sword cuts, and what it cuts is not the enemy. It is the confusion. The third layer, accessible only in states of sustained high coherence, is what I would call the commission. The specific, personal transmission that is not general guidance, but particular instruction. This is the layer that tells you not just that you are accompanied, not just that you can see clearly, but what specifically you are here to do with your life, your gifts, your field. This is the layer that most people never reach, not because they are not worthy of it, but because sustaining the coherent state required to receive it is the work of a lifetime of practice. It does not arrive in a single session. It arrives in the accumulated coherence of a field that has been consistently trained to hold truth without distortion. But here is what I want you to know about all three layers. They are all present in the transmission right now. All three are broadcasting. The question is only which layer your field is coherent enough to receive today. And whatever layer you can receive today is exactly the right one. You do not need to be at the third layer to have your life changed by the first. The carrier wave alone, the felt sense of accompaniment, the knowing that you are not alone in what you are carrying, is enough to shift the broadcast of your field. And when your field shifts its broadcast, reality shifts what it assembles around you. This is the physics of the hidden message becoming unhidden. I want to say something specific about the third layer, the commission, because I think it is the one that most people have the most complicated relationship with. Many people have had a glimpse of it, a moment, sometimes in childhood, sometimes in a crisis, sometimes in a moment of unusual stillness, when something arrived that felt like a direct knowing of what they were here for. Not an ambition, not a plan, a knowing, clear and specific, and without the usual noise of self-doubt. And then the noise came back, and the knowing faded. And they spent years afterward wondering if they had imagined it, or if it had been real but was no longer available, or if they had somehow disqualified themselves from receiving it again. Here is what I want you to know about that experience. You did not imagine it. It was real. It was a moment of field coherence that was sufficient to receive the third layer of the transmission. And it is still broadcasting. The commission that arrived in that moment has not been revoked. It has not been reassigned to someone more deserving. It is still in the transmission, still waiting for your field to develop the sustained coherence to receive it fully. Not as a flash, but as a clear, stable, ongoing knowing that you can act from. This is one of the most important things Michael's frequency carries: the persistence of the commission. The transmission does not give up on the field it is addressed to. It does not move on. It continues broadcasting at the same frequency with the same content for as long as it takes for the receiver to develop the coherence to hold it. The only question is how long you will spend in the static before you build the field that can receive what has been waiting for you. Let me give you something specific to work with in your daily life, because the practice I gave you earlier was a single session, and what I want for you is a field that shifts its baseline. There is a specific coherence practice that you can do in any moment, anywhere, without anyone knowing you are doing it. It takes less than 60 seconds, and done consistently multiple times a day, it will change your field's baseline coherence state over the course of weeks. Here is how it works. The moment you notice that your field has moved into a low coherence state, whether that is anxiety about something coming, irritation at something that happened, the low-level hum of chronic vigilance, whatever the specific flavor of incoherence is in that moment. Do this. Pause. Place your awareness in your chest. Not your hand, just your awareness. Feel the center of your chest as a distinct location in your body. Then bring to mind, as quickly as you can, a single, specific moment of genuine appreciation. It does not have to be profound. It does not have to be related to the situation. It just has to be real. A specific sensory memory that carries genuine warmth. Hold that memory in your chest for 5 breaths. 5 slow, chest-centered breaths with a genuine memory of appreciation active in your field. That is the entire practice. It takes less than 60 seconds. What you are doing in those 60 seconds is this. You are introducing a coherent signal into an incoherent field. You are using the specific neurological mechanism by which genuine positive emotion reorganizes heart rate variability to move your field from noise toward signal. You are, in the most literal electromagnetic sense, tuning your receiver. Do this 5 times a day, every day, for 30 days. Do it when you remember to, not when conditions are perfect. Do it in parking lots and in line at the store and in the moment before a difficult conversation. Do it when it feels mechanical and you're not sure it's working. The field doesn't care whether you feel inspired while you practice. It responds to the practice regardless. Coherence is coherence. The field organizes itself around the signal, not around your opinion of the signal. At the end of 30 days, you will have a different field. Not dramatically different in every external circumstance, measurably different in its coherence. Baseline, and a field with a higher coherence baseline receives more of what the transmission is carrying. You will begin to notice things arriving in the quieter moments, clarity where there was confusion, steadiness where there was anxiety, a sense of being accompanied that arrives not as a dramatic experience, but as a quiet, persistent quality of your daily life. That is the message becoming unhidden, not all at once, layer by layer, as your field develops the coherence to receive each one. Now, I want to address something that some of you are thinking right now, because I can feel it in the field of this conversation. Some of you are wondering whether this is real, whether the transmission is real, whether Michael is real, whether any of this is more than a sophisticated way of talking about the psychology of self-regulation. This is a good question. It is a coherent question. And I want to give you a coherent answer. The electromagnetic field your heart generates is real, measurable, documented. The effect of heart rate variability, coherence on perception, on immune function, on cognitive performance, on the fields of people around you. All of this is documented in peer-reviewed research. These are not contested findings. They are reproducible, measured, real. The question of whether there is a specific high coherence transmission that can be called Archangel Michael, whether that transmission originates from an entity with genuine independent existence, or from the deepest layers of the quantum field itself, or from some dimension of reality that our current instruments cannot yet measure. That question is genuinely open. I am not going to pretend to certainty I don't have. What I can tell you is this: the frequency is real. The experience of receiving it is real. The effects on the field of someone who receives it are measurable in their coherent state, in their perception, in the quality of their decisions, in the nature of what reality assembles around them in the weeks and months that follow. Whether you want to call the source of that frequency Archangel Michael, or the quantum field's highest coherent state, or the deepest intelligence of your own energy field, recognizing itself, the frequency is the same. The mechanics are the same. The effects are the same. And here is what I believe, with the full weight of everything I understand about how fields work. The traditions that encoded this frequency in the figure of Michael were not naive. They were precise. They were encoding something real about the structure of reality, about the existence of high coherence transmissions that are available to human fields that develop sufficient coherence to receive them in the most durable form they had available: story, symbol, and practice. The symbol is not the thing, but the symbol points at the thing with remarkable accuracy. So whether you receive this transmission as a message from an angelic being, or as the activation of your own field's highest coherence potential, or as your nervous system finally learning to entrain to the most organized signal in its environment, receive it. The reception is what matters. The mechanics work regardless of the metaphysics. Let me tell you what changes when the reception becomes consistent. There is a woman whose name, for the purpose of this telling, is Seren. She had been practicing the coherence work we have been discussing for about 4 months when she noticed something that she initially dismissed as coincidence. She had been dealing with a situation at work that had been generating chronic low-level dread for almost a year. A relationship with a colleague that was consistently draining, consistently unclear, consistently producing the kind of low-grade friction that wears a nervous system down without ever rising to the level of a crisis that demands resolution. Seren had tried every external approach she could think of. Different communication strategies, different ways of framing the relationship to herself, different levels of distance and proximity. Nothing changed the essential quality of it. 4 months into consistent coherence practice, something shifted. Not in the colleague, in Seren's field. She walked into the office one morning, and something was different. She couldn't name it immediately. She just noticed that the dread was absent. Not suppressed, absent. She went through her day, and the interactions with her colleague happened, and they were not dramatically different in their surface content, but they felt different. The friction was still there, but it no longer penetrated her field. It arrived at the edge of her electromagnetic presence and simply did not go further. What had changed was her field's coherence. A coherent field is not a field without boundaries. It is a field with natural coherence-based protection. When your poor electromagnetic field is organized and clear, incoherent signals from outside it have less penetrating power, not because you are defended in the effortful sense, because the organized field is simply not a match for the incoherent signal. Entrainment works in both directions. A coherent field can pull an incoherent one toward organization, but a sufficiently coherent field can also simply not entrain to incoherence. It maintains its own frequency. This is the protective function of Michael's transmission. This is why the tradition describes him as the protector, not because he fights off threats with supernatural force, because the frequency he carries, when received and integrated by a human field, raises that field's coherence to a level where it naturally resists the penetrating effect of incoherent signals. You become, in the electromagnetic sense, harder to destabilize. Not harder in the rigid sense. Organized. And organized fields are inherently more stable than incoherent ones. Seren's colleague didn't change. The situation didn't dramatically resolve. What changed was that Seren's field stopped being a match for the incoherence the situation carried. And over the following weeks, something interesting happened. The colleague began to interact with her differently. Not dramatically, but the friction reduced. The energy of their exchanges became gradually more neutral. Not because Seren did anything different externally, because her field was broadcasting a different signal. and the colleague's nervous system, reading that field unconsciously, began to respond to what the field was actually saying, rather than to what the dread had been saying. This is the creative function of field coherence. What you radiate, reality assembles around, not as a metaphysical claim, as a description of how electromagnetic fields interact with the nervous systems of everyone in their range, and how those nervous systems then generate behavior that becomes the reality you experience. Michael's transmission, received and integrated, does not change the external world by magic. It changes your field, and your field changes the world by the most ordinary, measurable, physical mechanism available: the electromagnetic influence of one coherent field on the incoherent fields it encounters. I want to add one more dimension to Seren's story, because there is something in it that I think most people miss when they first hear it. The protection that her field developed was not a wall. This is a critical distinction. A wall is a rigid structure that keeps things out by force. It is also a structure that keeps things in. A person who builds a wall around their field to protect it from incoherence is also walling out the transmissions they most need to receive. The coherence-based protection that Seren developed was the opposite of a wall. It was an organized field that was fully open, fully receptive, fully available to high coherence transmissions, while being naturally non-resonant with incoherent ones. She didn't close. She organized. And the organization itself was the protection. This is one of the things that makes Michael's frequency so specific and so different from the protection strategies most people use. Most people protect themselves by contracting, by closing, by building vigilance into a kind of armor. And the armor works in the sense that it keeps some things out, but it also keeps the transmission out. You cannot simultaneously armor yourself against incoherence and remain open to coherence. The armor does not discriminate. It blocks everything. Michael's frequency shows your field a different way. Not armor, coherence. A field so organized that it does not need to defend itself because it does not entrain to what would destabilize it. This is the protection of the light, not the protection of the fortress, and it is available to you in precisely the degree to which you develop your field's coherence. Now let me bring you to the deeper layer of what the hidden message actually says, because we have been approaching it, and I want to bring you all the way to it. The message, at its core, is this: you were not made for the frequency of fear. This is not a comfort statement. This is a structural observation about what you actually are. Your electromagnetic field, at its highest coherence, generates a signal that is so organized, so precisely aligned with truth, so free of the distortion that fear introduces, that it functions as a carrier wave for reality itself. You were built, at the level of your actual quantum nature, to be a coherent field in a world of incoherence. Not to be better than incoherence, to be a point of coherence that incoherence can entrain to. This is what Michael's transmission is reminding you of. Not that you should be brave, not that you should try harder, not that you should overcome your fear by force of will, but that fear is not your native frequency. It is a learned state of your field. It is what happens when a field that was built for coherence is subjected to enough incoherent input, enough threat, enough chronic low-level stress, that it begins to organize itself around the incoherence as a survival strategy. It is adaptive, it is understandable, and it is not who you are at the level of your actual electromagnetic nature. The hidden message is not information you didn't have. It is a frequency you had forgotten. A reminder delivered at the quantum level of what your field actually is when it is not organized around survival. It is the frequency of a field that is so coherent, so clear, so precisely aligned with what is actually true, that it does not need to be afraid. Not because nothing threatening exists, but because it is organized enough to respond to threat without being defined by it. This is what you are being invited back to, not to a state you have never experienced, to a state that is your actual nature, that you have touched in moments throughout your life, that you have sometimes felt in the middle of difficulty as that inexplicable steadiness, that clarity that arrived when everything else was confused, that sense of something standing with you that was larger than the situation. You have always known this frequency. You have just been told by the accumulated weight of a world organized around incoherence that it was not reliable, that you couldn't live there, that the vigilance was necessary. Michael's message is that the vigilance is the thing that is costing you everything, and the coherence you have been protecting yourself from. The open, organized, non-defended clarity of a field that is not afraid is the thing that would give you everything the vigilance was trying to secure. This is the hidden message. It was hidden not in a secret text, not in a coded transmission that only the initiated can access. It was hidden in the gap between the frequency of your chronic vigilance and the frequency of your own highest coherence. It was hidden in the static you had learned to call your baseline. And now you have heard it. What happens next is up to your field. Here is what I want you to do in the days following this transmission, not as a spiritual obligation, as an experiment in electromagnetic reality. For the next 7 days, practice the 60-second coherence. Reset 5 times a day. Set a reminder if you need to. Do it when you remember. Do it imperfectly. The field does not require perfection. It requires consistency. At the end of each day, take 2 minutes and ask yourself one question. What arrived today that I might have missed if my field had been noisier? Not what dramatic thing happened. What quiet thing arrived? A thought that felt different from your ordinary thoughts. A moment of clarity. A sense of steadiness in a moment that usually produces anxiety. A quality of presence that wasn't there before. Write it down if you can. Not because the writing makes it more real, because the act of noticing and recording trains your attention to look for what the coherent field is receiving. And what you consistently attend to, you develop the capacity to receive more of. At the end of 7 days, you will have a record of what a field in developing coherence begins to receive. And I promise you, because this is not a promise about magic, but about physics, you will find things in that record that you did not expect. Moments of reception that you might have dismissed as coincidence or imagination if you had not been paying attention. The transmission is consistent. The question is always whether the receiver is tuned. You are tuning it now. Every time you practice. Every time you choose coherence over vigilance. Every time you feel the warmth in your chest and recognize it as real, as electromagnetic, as the signal of a field that is organizing itself around something more powerful than fear. I want to offer you one more specific tool for that 7-day experiment, because the daily noticing practice is powerful, and I want to give it a sharper edge. Each evening, when you ask yourself what arrived today that you might have missed, also ask this: where did my field hold when it usually would have collapsed? Because this is one of the most important early signs of developing coherence, and it is easy to overlook because it announces itself as an absence rather than a presence. You will not always notice the clarity that arrived, but you may notice that the anxiety that usually arrives in a certain kind of situation did not arrive with its usual force today. You may notice that a conversation that would normally have destabilized your field for hours left you steady. You may notice that you made a decision that usually takes you days of agonizing in a matter of minutes without the usual suffering. These absences are not nothing. They are evidence of a field that is developing the coherence to hold what previously overwhelmed it. They are the sword of discernment beginning to do its work. Note them. They are the transmission landing. Your field is changing. It has been changing since you began listening to this transmission. Not because my words are magic, because the content of what we have been exploring, the specific mechanics of coherence, the precise nature of what is being received, the felt sense of accompaniment that has been threading through this entire conversation. These are themselves coherence-producing signals. Your nervous system has been receiving them and responding. Your heart rate variability has been shifting in small ways throughout this listening. The receiver has been tuning. You are already more coherent than you were when we began. If this transmission has moved something in your field, consider returning to it in a quiet moment, in the stillness of early morning before the day's noise arrives, or in that receptive space just before sleep when your field is most open. Those are the moments when the layers go deeper. And if someone in your life is caught in the static of chronic vigilance, in the managed fear that has become their baseline, consider sharing this with them. When you pass this frequency to another field, something real happens. Their awareness of their own light begins to activate. Your fields strengthen each other through resonance, and the coherence ripples outward into the collective field in ways neither of you may ever fully trace. That is not a small thing. That is how the luminosity spreads. Let me close with what I most want you to carry from this. The message from Michael's frequency is not a message about the future. It is a message about what you are right now. It is not telling you who you will become if you do everything right. It is showing you who you already are at the level of your actual electromagnetic nature, beneath the learned patterns of vigilance and fear and managed anxiety that have organized your field for years or decades. You are a coherent field. That is not an aspiration. That is a description of your fundamental nature. The coherence is what your field returns to when the incoherence is removed. You don't build it. You reveal it. You stop maintaining the vigilance long enough for what was always underneath to surface. And what was always underneath is this: a field so organized, so precisely aligned with truth, so free of the distortion that fear introduces, that it can receive transmissions from the highest coherence states in the quantum field around it. A field that is, in the most literal sense, built to receive guidance, protection, clarity, and the specific knowing of what it is here to do. This is what Michael's transmission has been trying to tell you, not from outside you, from the frequency that your own field recognizes as kin, as the same quality of coherence that you carry in your deepest nature. The transmission is not foreign to you. It is familiar. It feels like coming home because it is the frequency of what you actually are when you are not organized around fear. Your field knows this, even if your mind is still processing it, even if part of you is still deciding whether to trust it. Your field, right now, in this moment, with the coherence that has been building throughout this transmission, your field knows. Feel it. That warmth in your chest, that steadiness that has been quietly present underneath the words, that quality of something settled that was not there at the beginning of this. That is not imagination. That is your electromagnetic field in a higher coherence state than it was when you arrived. That is the receiver, tuned. That is the transmission, received. The message is no longer hidden. It is here. It has always been here. And so have you. Go carry this frequency into your day, into your week, into the situations that have been generating the vigilance, into the relationships that have been draining your field, into the moments of difficulty where the fear says you are alone and the transmission says you are not. Carry the coherence you have built in this hour and let it be what it is. A field that is organized enough to face what comes, to receive what is true, to broadcast something more powerful than fear into the quantum field around you. And watch what assembles around that signal. Because what you radiate, reality assembles around. Your field is active. Your receiver is tuned. Your signal is clear. Welcome to the frequency.